I actually have up in my office. My mom gave me this. It's a sort of a dark gray, gunmetal kind of thing with. It's a plate about that big around, and it's got it's sort of a bowl, shallow bowl about that deep, etc. And it's metal. And my mom gave it to me, and she said, "Well, your dad's mother had this. Your grandmother had this. She was a pen pal with a German POW in a POW camp in Colorado during World War II. The U.S., when they took German prisoners, actually brought them to the U.S.
That seems wildly like...
Yeah, but so there were prison camps across the Midwest, and they set up pen pal systems. And my grandmother was pen pals with a German soldier, and he made that. They had them processing spent artillery shells he made the plate by beating an artillery shell casing into a plate and then sent it to my grandmother. And I just always think of it as this weird connection to how strange, we never think about there being POW camps in the United States, but there were.
Well, it just seems wildly inefficient to ship.
Well, it actually was more efficient because you didn't have to have a whole lot of security, because they're not going to get away and go back, all the way across the Atlantic.
Where are they going to go? Kansas City?
Exactly, and so it was pretty minimal. They were pretty minimal security camps. They fed them well, and as far as I know, and they treated, so there was little incentive to escape because, where are you going to go, right?
Okay. Yeah, I feel like also if we couldn't speak English, I feel like at that point everybody would be like, a German in Iowa.
Although...
Well, actually, no, German in Iowa, they'd be like, that's predictable.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know where people settle this things.
I was just talking about my grandmother, and she lived in a small farming community in southwestern Minnesota, and my dad, who grew up there, had cousins he couldn't talk to because they only spoke German. And that was, World War II. They were not put in camps. Any other thoughts on Thin Red Line, or what do you think of the Gubar reading or the Jones reading? I guess I didn't realize you guys actually got the Jones reading. I didn't see it, so. Gubar or Jones, or Goldstein if you want to go back to the last Tuesday, because we didn't talk about the Goldstein and all those charts he had about men versus women and aggression and upper body strength and all the rest.
I had my B-Girls poster in this one. I'm pretty sure.
Yes, this one had all the posters with the...
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've talked enough so that I don't really feel we need to do, if you guys don't have anything to say about that. But I will just point out that the Gubar reading, I think, does an interesting... Yeah.
I just want to say that I think it's funny how, in the German prisoner of war camps, they actually treated them, decently well, but then in the internment camps, for literal civilians,
Yep.
they treated them terribly just because the civilians were not white. I mean,
racism is a hell of a
because
drug.
yeah, it's of course there's the whole thing of Pearl Harbor and all that stuff, but if the Japanese had been white, the Americans, the U.S. would not have responded. That would probably not have done the internment camps because they wouldn't have been fueled by racism.
Yeah, and the war was over by the time they had an atomic bomb, but it's an interesting question. If the war in Europe hadn't been over, would they have used an atomic bomb in Europe?
And also, would the other European countries that weren't Germany have had thoughts about, would France have been so that was crazy that you dropped an atomic bomb right across our border?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys noticed this just this week. The U.S. has sort of made it clear that its commitment to NATO is shaky right now.
Yeah.
And France just offered to deploy. France and England are the only nuclear powers outside. Russia has nuclear weapons, but in Western Europe, France and England are the only nuclear powers. And France offered to deploy its nuclear missiles in Poland or Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, or Slovakia, or any place on the Russian border, which I thought was a rather big.
That's a crazy aggression move for a You're not supposed to be using those nuclear missiles. We have treaties.
You are not, but I think it's an attempt to basically say to Putin, yeah, you're going to threaten us with nuclear weapons, we're going to threaten you with nuclear weapons. We got them.
World War II, electric boogaloo.
Pardon?
World War II, electric boogaloo.
Well, India and Pakistan have started open aggression again, and they are both nuclear powers.
Yes. The one thing on the Gubar that I think is really important is that Gubar is basically pointing out that in World War II, World War II was much worse for women than World War I, I'll put it that way. That World War I, the percentage of people who died in World War I who were women was really small. I think it was less than 5% of the people who died in the war were women. And women were, for the most part, not in combat zones. They occasionally got caught in combat, but the combat was concentrated on the Western Front, and women generally were not in that zone unless they were ambulance drivers, etc. In World War II, because of bombing campaigns, women are very much victims of the war because they're just dropping bombs on cities, and the Germans are carrying out mass executions and killing women and children. Also, both sides. It's the war. The war is a war of movement, so it sweeps through areas, and women can't get out of the way. Old people can't either. Children can't. So there's a lot more civilians caught up in World War II. And civilians are explicitly targeted by the bombing campaigns, right? The Germans targeted the British population in London, and they wiped Coventry off the map. And then in response, the Americans and British wiped all the German cities off the map. With a couple exceptions, but yeah, listen.
So, kind of going off the talking about like current stuff and in the context of this class, how likely do you think it is that like anytime in the future, by any time I mean like not the near future, but like just straight up any time, that like people that there might actually be like a nuclear war? Because like everybody knows it's a terrible idea, but there are enough people in history who've been like kind of dumb in that way, where like they could have, in theory, like made that decision. I mean, nuclear weapons haven't been around for very long, but like there are enough situations in history where it's like if they had been around, would they have been used?
That's a good question. I mean, the assumption that most military strategists make is that there are two cases where you would use nuclear weapons. One is if you thought you were going to get into that a conflict with another nuclear power was inevitable, and you didn't think you could win it, and so you wanted to wipe them out before they could, you basically do the Pearl Harbor attack. You're going to wipe them out before they can hit you. But that's generally thought of not being much of a problem because, the United States and the Soviet Union are the obvious villains, the obvious potential villains there, but they both have basically systems in place to launch their own missiles if the other side launches their missiles, so you don't win, right? And that's the idea, is you make that so that you can't win. So that, in theory, wouldn't happen. Now, would it happen? I don't know. But in theory, that won't happen. The other is that if you have a conventional war that's going so badly that a nation is facing complete destruction, like, for instance, if Germany at the end of 1945 had nuclear weapons, would they have used them just out of spite, knowing that they weren't going to win this war, but they're going to take down as many people as possible? That's the more scary one, especially if you have world leaders who are probably sociopathic and maybe psychopathic. Yeah. Would the sort of narcissism mean that if they thought they were threatened, they were going to literally want to take down everybody else? They want to wipe out everybody else because they're threatened with annihilation themselves. That's a good question. If you say any time, then I gotta say it's probably highly likely because any given year there's probably less than 1% chance, but after a century you're now 1% every year for a century. There's a fair chance it might happen at some point. So why?
I don't know. Well, it reminds me of two things. One, I think Putin just recently gave an interview where he showed like his Moscow apartment flat, and he invited the guy who was interviewing him to have like this milk with him or whatever. It's just the most bizarre, like, because he's
Trying to
acting.
humanize himself.
Yeah, he's acting normal and he looks perfectly fine, but you know he's not. And so it's just kind of creepy.
It is odd when the like supreme leader
Right.
dictator for the past decade is trying to humanize himself in the international stage.
It also reminds me of the movie Doctor Strangelove.
Uh-huh.
Which, I mean, that's just such a great movie, and there's so much to unpack in that movie. But my favorite quote from that movie is when they're in the war room, and I think the Russian and the American break out in a fight, and the president says, "Gentlemen, it's the war room. You cannot fight in here."
Yes.
It's the most wonderful.
Yes, it's even better. Gentlemen, there's no fighting in the war room. Eric.
Were you taught to hide under these?
No, I was taught to go to the boiler room of my elementary school, which had fallout shelter and a big sign on the front of it, and supposedly that would keep us all safe. But we did not do crawl under your desk drills.
Did you watch the turtle, the commercial with the turtle?
Yeah, no, we didn't. No, that was after me, apparently. We did the big event. In the early 1980s, I was probably in middle school, I guess. There was a TV series that came out, or not a series, but a mini series called The Day After.
Oh, that British one.
Yeah. And well, actually, there was. My son was just telling me about the British one, and I think what I saw was an American one because it was American actors. I remember Jason Robards was in it, and he's an American, but it's similar. You know, the first scene is what happens in nuclear war, and then the rest of it is how do people survive afterwards. You know, and you know, it was absolutely horrific. But I do remember doing drills where they would say, okay, we're going to line up and we're going to go down the hall to the boiler room where it's a fallout shelter, you know, because that'll save us, right? Zach, and then cut.
My dad grew up in the 70s and we lived in Tucson. Tucson has a massive Air Force base called Davis-Monthan, and because of that, it was in the top 5 places that if to be nuked, it was going to be nuked.
Yeah.
And they were taught that there was no time. If you hear the sirens coming, we're going to get hit, there's no time to get into your shelters. So just get under your desk and cover your head and you'll be just fine.
Yeah. I mean, you know, a big thing is how close are you to the epicenter of the blast? Because if you're more than 12 miles away, you probably getting under your desk might help. But if you're less than 12 miles away, no, it's not going to help at all. Okay.
Yeah, my parents all were also grew up in the 70s. Yeah, but my dad grew up in Montreal, and he was taught to hide under the desk. My mom grew up in Winnipeg, which is a stone's throw from North Dakota. So my dad was talking about that, I was like, really? You guys did drills? Because I guess Winnipeg was like, we're screwed. Yeah. I mean, North Dakota is filled with nuclear missile silos, and so yeah, North Dakota would be wiped off the map. It would, not that you could tell, but. Maybe get flattered.
Not far from where I live, there's like 1950s, 60s, just giant, massive like radio operation center where they could monitor these things specifically built. And apparently there's like quite a few of these built all across the United States and the Midwest. And just like these big chains to monitor this. It's amazing because the facility is huge and the amount of infrastructure and stuff, and it just was massive radio monitoring dome basically for it.
You should all see Dr. Strangelove, by the way. The full title of the movie is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It is a farcical look at the Cold War, made during the Cold War. Made in the, I don't know, it's a Stanley Kubrick film, and it's awesome.
Is that the one where it has the scene where it's like this guy walks in on like this Illuminati-esque like group conducting a what have you?
I don't remember that, but it's pretty bizarre, so that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, in the movie, the President of the United States is Peter Sellers, who played Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther movies, the farcical comedian. And he actually plays 3 different characters in this film.
When they do that.
But he's President of the United States, and his main advisor on nuclear issues is Dr. Strangelove, who speaks with a strong German accent and he's disabled, he's in a wheelchair, but he periodically just blurts out, "Mein Führer!" and then he has to pull his arm down like this. And he's obviously a former Nazi, but
Yeah.
and it's a truly bizarre but wonderful film, and it really exposes just how idiotic the Cold War was. I mean, just how darkly idiotic. I mean, but yeah, one of the main characters is named Bat Guano.
Yeah. I love that.
That's
And-
so great.
And one of my favorite scenes is Peter Sellers' character is a British intelligence officer, and he realizes they've launched the nuclear airplanes to start a nuclear war, and he nobody had the code to recall them, and the British officer finds the code, and he's like, "I've got to call Washington, give them the code so they can recall the bombers." And the only phone that's working is a pay phone. And he's like, "I don't have any money." And he turns to Bat Guano and says, "Shoot that soda pop machine and get the money out of there." And he says, "That's the property of the Coca-Cola Company of America. I can't do that." He's like, "The fate of the world rests on it." He's like, "Okay, but you're going to answer to the Coca-Cola Corporation." It's a fantastic movie. You should all see it. I don't know whether I'd more highly recommend reading Catch-22 or watching Doctor Strangelove.
Why not both?
Why not both? You'll understand the 60s much better. The one other thing I wanted to just mention on the Gubar is Gubar really does an interesting job of pointing out the ways that World War II in particular, there was a sort of masculinity amongst soldiers and in propaganda for the war that had a really ambivalent message towards women. That women were, that World War II, more than World War I, had, and you saw this in Saving Private Ryan a little bit, had a very, it had the whole idea that you set mothers up as the loving person back home, but women are over there, and this is about male bonding. This is about masculinity. And to a certain extent, women become sort of resented threats that the soldiers felt like they're defending women, but women don't understand it, they don't appreciate it, etc. And women are dangerous also because they're sexually attractive, but they're also diseased, and etc. And then there's this idea of the Jones readings really captured, and it comes out much more in if you ever read Norman Mailer in The Naked and the Dead. This idea that violence is slightly erotic. That soldiers are basically transferring eroticism from women who they now resent to a sort of, everyone know the difference between homosexual and homosocial?
Yeah.
Everyone besides Jackson. So, homosexual means sex between two people of the same sex. Homosocial means when you have a group that is entirely made up of one sex, and you have bonding happening between members of the same sex that is not explicitly sexual, but Gubar points out that the homosocial bonding in groups of men in World War II often bled over into either homosexuality or at least an eroticism. And because the purpose of the male group bonding was violence, that eroticism kind of gets transferred to violence. That the obvious phallic symbol of the gun and all of the, for lack of a better word, Gubar doesn't say this, but the penetration involved in bullets, etc. That there's an eroticism around violence, and you sort of get this out of that Jones reading when they find the dead body, and they sort of it's vaguely erotic, right? And Jones goes on riffs about this. I don't think it was in the section I had you read, but he talks quite a bit about guys having sex in the tents and just sort of pretending that's not happening. You're just helping a buddy out. You're not really gay. You're just helping a buddy out. But there's a whole charged sense of masculine homosociality that can bleed over into an eroticized homosexuality, but often doesn't. It just stays as erotically charged homosocial behavior, right? And we saw a little bit of Saving Private Ryan with the guys kissing at each other and whatever, And Gubar points out that one key factor in this is an overt and explicit demeaning of the possibility of homosexuality. The gay men aren't real men, and that's something you make fun of, etc. And it's a way of sort of saying, okay, we're really close. We're putting our arms around each other. We're kissing at each other. This is really charged, but we're not gay because we hate gay people. And so there's a real sort of policing there of a sort of derogatory treatment of any idea of homosexuality, but also this derogatorily charged homosexuality.
That's so interesting because it's literally like high school boys sports team locker room masculinity. Like,
yes, and that's not a bad comparison at all. There.
Still exists.
Well, I think it's structural in the sense that given the nature of war and putting men in danger, and then making these intense circumstances and the intense bonds that soldiers, get with each other, it's sort of structurally always going to be there in a sense. Why?
You mentioning Norman Mailer made me think of Gore Vidal. And I mean, Gore Vidal was quite obviously, he was openly gay, but he was
gay people.
Yeah, like he was kind of resentful of the fact he was like very like, there's homosexual acts, but there's, that's it. And so it's really interesting, because he was in the Second World War, but then he was kind of reserved, but he was this really great author, and then he, wrote some really just stuff that pissed a lot of people off, which was quite good. And just one really quick question. Was it Norman Mailer who stabbed his wife? Or was that somebody else?
That sounds like in character, but I don't know.
Okay.
That sounds in character.
Quite random.
Kylie.
I mean, my mind goes that's even older too. Like, obviously, it happened in like lots of historic wars. That's happened a lot. And this one we're like, no, it's bad, like freaking out, even though that's a thing that just kind of is.
Well, part of what you saw in the Jarvis reading, the army itself was worried about it for maybe the first time. I mean, most armies just ignored it, whatever happens in the tents, we don't care. But the U.S. Army really thought that they had to weed out homosexuality or gay men because it would undermine the fighting prowess of the other men. And so the U.S. military was really worried about it in World War II for maybe the first time.
Well, is this the first war that happened since like homosexuality becomes like a clearly
World War I
defined category? There was like, because
it was around. I mean, it was recognized as a category.
Yeah, but I was just thinking like, because like a lot of the like research, like post World War I, there was all of the like in Germany, there's all the like sexology and stuff, and like in America, a little bit, to a lesser extent, like that was a lot. But like, there's a lot like by the time World War II comes around, like homosexuality has become like this kind of like set in stone thing. Like this exists. Yeah. It's at the time like a mental or like medical disorder, probably. For most people. But like, and like also like the 40s is when like you see like the first like homosexual activists like start appearing.
I really think that, I mean, World War I, I'm not aware of there being that much concern about it. It definitely was there. I mean, Oscar Wilde was 20 years before, before World War I. So I mean, there was definitely something there, but I think the 20s brought homosexuality out in the open more, both through like, Magnus Hirschfeld's, Institute on Sexual Research in Berlin, and, cross-dressing clubs and, et cetera. So it was much more culturally prevalent or visible by World War II, so that might have something to do with the sort of panic about it also. Probably in the line.
I was just saying, before World War I, nothing sexual at all, and nothing sexual but after. It's all sexual. Yeah.
I'm reminded of another Stanley Kubrick movie, Barry Lyndon, which is set in the 18th century, and in the beginning of it's, a few army scenes where these two characters, it's almost like a father-son relationship, but then the one character dies, and there's a very heavy, like, erotic atmosphere, and so it is really interesting. It's like, is he trying to convey that message, or just that they were generally affectionate, and I feel like during that time period when homosexual wasn't like a defined thing, it does really bleed over to like just general affection.
I think one of the issues that we have to deal with is that up until the 20th century, there was a great deal more male physical touching in friendship that was not considered romantic or erotic, because homosexuality was so taboo that nobody thought, two men touching each other in public couldn't possibly be sexual, because nobody would do that. So it must just be innocent or something. And in the 20th century, I feel like, especially perhaps in World War II, but you began to see a real sort of policing of homosexuality by policing how much men could touch each other. Because anything could be suspected now. If homosexuality is now culturally visible, then you have to police against it, right? It's out there. and you have to be, but whereas before it was like, this is so taboo it doesn't exist, or it only happens in the strangest of circumstances, so we don't have to worry about it. But now, homosexuality is common and prevalent, we'd better police it and make sure that nobody is doing anything.
We're putting the phobia and homophobia.
Yeah, exactly. Putting the phobia and homophobia, yeah. All right, any other thoughts before I talk at you for a little bit? I'm not going to talk too much, but I do want to talk about women in World War II for just a little bit.